Man, Halloween must be like Scott's favorite holiday or something, because most of the FNaF games have either big Halloween updates, or Halloween is just heavily referenced. With the first three games, when your computer is set to October 31st, a pumpkin and some orange lights decorate the office. With FNaF 4, there was a big Halloween update. Then we have FNaF World with Update 2, which was Halloween-centric. FNaF 6 has some Halloween posters outside the alleyway, Help Wanted has Curse of Fredbear, and Help Wanted 2 has some levels that take place in Fall Fest. There could be more that I'm not remembering, but the point is, Halloween is tied heavily with FNaF. But why? Now, before this video properly begins, I want to put a disclaimer that most of the things I say in this video is more speculation and predictions rather than an actual structured theory. And another thing, I want to give credit to Impulse Evan for some of the ideas that will be presented in this video, specifically his 3 videos about Fredbear's Family Diner and the Fall Fest. These 3 videos is where I got some of the ideas from, so credit goes to him. Anyways, back to the video. Ever since Help Wanted 2 released, the question of why Halloween is important for FNaF has been thrust upon us again. Reason being, one of the prizes you can sometimes get in the game is that of a poster for Fall Fest 1970. This is the second time we have seen this early in the timeline, with the first being Fredbear's singing show. But this poster can possibly help us explain the origins of Fazbear Entertainment, and could possibly hint to the future of FNAF's story post-Ruin. How? Let me explain. The earliest Fall Fest we know of is 1970. Then in Curse of Fredbear, we see Fall Fest 83. Then in Help Wanted 2, we see modern day Fall Fest with the appearances of the Glamrocks. So Fall Fest is an ongoing tradition with Fazbear Entertainment, which could mean that Fazbear Entertainment started slightly before or during 1970. And no, just because Freddy Fazbear's Pizza opened in 1983 doesn't mean Fazbear Entertainment was founded in 1983. The characters themselves could have existed before the restaurants. But what is Fall Fest? From what we can gather from Help Wanted 1 and 2, Fall Fest seems to be a carnival attraction located in a pumpkin patch, celebrating the spooky season. The carnival area is filled with all sorts of attractions, like Pirate Ride, a corn maze, Fazer Blast, and the carousel. There are also some attractions that could be a part of the Fall Fest as well, being the Legend of the Terrible Man-Wolf, a circus-type attraction filled with clowns, bears, and the ventriloquist, but these could all just be a part of the Spook Fest rather than actual Fall Fest. But I thought I'd mention them nonetheless. And it's not really clear if Fall Fest and Spook Fest are the same. Sure, they have similar titles, but there's really not a lot pointing for them being the same. So I'll just assume for now that they're different. So in conclusion, Fall Fest is a carnival attraction that opens every year in autumn. This festival could connect to the suits we see in Ruin, where the animals look like they come from a circus or a carnival. Also in Ruin, we see a Fredbear cutout, which has the same style as the other Fredbear posters. This cutout is named 70s Freddy. This Fredbear also has a more brown color rather than the yellow Fredbear we all know. So back in the 70s, Freddy and Fredbear were once the same character, which is also supported by Fredbear's singing show, where Fredbear in this show is called Freddy. And this could be the reason why Fredbear and Freddy shared very similar designs, because they were once the same character. Speaking of the singing show, it also seems to be an attraction at Fall Fest, or at least it was created earlier than Fall Fest, since the poster looks older than the 1970s Fall Fest poster. So Fazbear as a character has existed for a long time, and is most likely the main mascot for Fall Fest, which is supported by this Fall Fest poster with the Fazbear band. But I don't think the early Fall Fest events used the characters in their animatronic forms. Let me explain. As we all know, the diner, the first restaurant, used Springlock suits, but it's revealed in the story Pressure that Springlock suits didn't last for a long time. The suits were discontinued not long after they were created, because the locking mechanisms were often faulty. they could get triggered by the movements of the costume's occupant, and if they were triggered fully, the metal clamps would shoot out and impale the occupant, fatally. But since Fall Fest existed in 1970, then the partners possibly didn't use animatronics at first, but just regular mascot suits, like the ones we see in The Mimic, the Tales epilogues, and Ruin. That's why Henry had them in the FNaF 6 location in the first place. They were all a part of Fazbear's history. They were all from Fall Fest. But from what we see from a lot of the Fall Fest content, we see that animatronics are used at the Fall Fest. So I think the mascot suits that were used were turned into animatronics, which is what happens in The Mimic. Edwin is sent costumes from Fazbear Entertainment, and he's tasked to make endoskeletons for these costumes. The costumes that Fazbear Entertainment sent Edwin could have been suits that were used in Fall Fest, which is interesting since it's implied that the story itself takes place in 1979. And yes, while the most popular consensus is that The Mimic takes place in 1984, if we look at the story itself on its own, it's implied that it takes place in the 70s, since Edwin started his company in the early 70s, which was 5 years prior to the story. And I know this creates problems with the storyteller and the timeline, which I don't really want to get into, so for now let's just ignore the storyteller and pretend that The Mimic takes place in 1979. In the story, Edwin has been working for Fazbear's for a year and a half, so like from 1977 to 1979. That would mean that spring suits were introduced in 1977, since one of the costumes Edwin worked on was a spring lock suit. So he maybe was just creating spring lock mechanisms for some of the suits. But the spring suits being introduced in 1977 seems a little contradictory to Pressure, since the suits were banned in 1985, and 8 years seems like a long time to be discontinued not long after they were created. So for the sake of my sanity, I'll just assume that this paragraph describes the spring suits being introduced at Freddy's, and not in general, since the Fredbear era isn't really talked about much, and may not even be known by the public. So yeah, back to The Mimic. Some of the costumes that was sent to Edwin in 1979 were of Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. These are possibly the OG Fazbear band from the 85 location, and before The Mimic, they were possibly used in Fall Fest, which aligns with what Phone Guy says when he tells us that the characters haven't been washed for 20 years. So maybe, back in 1973, the OG band were created, but not as animatronics, but only as mascot suits. Then in the 80s, they would get turned into animatronics like the other costumes sent by Edwin. But I do want to address something. I'm not saying Edwin made the original Fazbear band's endoskeletons. It's said in the story itself that when a Fazbear team explored the factory after Edwin had abandoned it, they find the OG4, and they are specifically called costumes and not animatronics. So Edwin probably never finished these suits. While yes, Edwin did work on Chica throughout the story, he only worked on the head. We never see him completely finish her. So when he abandons the factory, everything is left either incomplete or straight up not even worked on. So Henry could have swooped in and finished all of them, and the story won't contradict anything from the games. But let's say for the sake of argument, assume that Edwin did in fact make the endoskeletons for the Core 4. Henry is still technically their creator. He made the concept of the characters and he probably made the costumes himself in 1973. The last thing I want to point out in The Mimic is that the story never specifically states that the animatronics Edwin made was for restaurants, so he probably made the endoskeletons of these costumes so they could be used for Fall Fest. I mean, we do see OG Foxy himself in his pirate ride in Fall Fest, so maybe this was Foxy's original attraction before Pirate Cove. Another reason I think Edwin's creations were used in Fall Fest is because of the Daycare Attendant. The origins of the Daycare Attendant was revealed to us in the Bobby Dots. The Sun Robot was an old stage animatronic. Part of its theatrical shtick was to turn evil when the stage lights went off. When it was reprogrammed to be the daycare attendant, the performance functions were taken out, but the darker trigger couldn't be removed. That, combined with the occasional blackouts in the daycare, created the moon side of the attendant, which results in several undesirable behaviors. Apparently, they had meetings about what to do, and they decided that fixing sun was more trouble than it was worth. It's cheaper to just make sure the lights stay on. I predict that the daycare attendant was a character in Fall Fest during his theatrical run, which is probably why Sun and Moon appear in the carousel level. Sun's voice comes from the carousel, and Moon is familiar with the carousel.
The merry-go-round broke down.
And we also have Jacko Moon, who fits in with the theme of Fall Fest. And maybe that's what Sun and Moon originally looked like back before being the daycare attendant. The carousel itself is described as an antique, so this carousel was used in Fall Fest back in the day. The daycare attendant's endo also has similar teeth to the mimic, so Edwin could have had a hand at creating Sun and Moon back in the 70s for Fall Fest. Now, let's talk about the diner. From all the evidence we have, Fredbear's Family Diner was the first Fazbear restaurant. Maybe with the success of Fall Fest, Henry and William were able to open up a small diner and expand the business. The characters that were used in the diner was Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, who are both spring suits. Since at this time, Fredbear and Freddy were still the same character, the Fredbear in the diner was still a brown bear, referred to as Freddy. And Spring Bonnie could have been a new character OC that was conceptualized by Afton. I always found it weird that the original Bonnie is named Spring Bonnie instead of, Bonnie. I mean, the first Freddy at least had a unique name and not just Spring Freddy. So what if the reason for this yellow rabbit being called Spring Bonnie is because this wasn't the first Bonnie character? He was the first animatronic Bonnie, but the character of Bonnie the Blue Bunny himself came before the yellow rabbit. If the costumes for the Fazbear Band were indeed created in 1973, then Spring Bonnie is not the first Bonnie character, and that's why he has Spring in the name, not just because it's a spring suit, but because it was technically a new Bonnie character that came after the original. Like how the future Freddy models have some title before the name Freddy. They all came after the original Freddy, and so they had to make it just slightly different to differentiate it from the OG Freddy. Then in, presumably the 80s, Freddy turned into a yellow bear and was just referred to as Fredbear. Reasons for this change is unknown, but one reason I can think of is because Freddy was already well known with his other bandmates. For Freddy to be just with a new similar looking bandmate and not include the others possibly didn't sit well with consumers. So maybe Henry and William made that change to appeal to their customers and kept Freddy where he was at the diner, but decided to just make him a slightly different character than the traditional Freddy and make him match with Spring Bonnie. And the traditional Freddy would still be used and paired up with his usual bandmates. There's also one detail that I remembered that could tie in more with Fall Fest. In the novel trilogy, Charlotte was kidnapped at a Halloween party at Fredbear's Family Diner in 1983. A Halloween party. Well, what do we always see in Fall Fest? The celebration of the Halloween season. So what if in the games, Charlie dies on Fall Fest 83, not at the festival itself, but at the location that's celebrating it? Hellpunted 2 does support the fact that Charlie died on 1983, with the puppet plush being gifted to us when we enter the code 1983 in the sister location level. So maybe her death being in Halloween could bleed into the games as well. Charlie's connection to Halloween doesn't even end here, since in FNaF 4's Halloween update, Nightmare, the final boss of the game, is replaced with Nightmare Rion, a darker reflection of what William did that Halloween. While Charlotte died in the novels at Fredbear's, in my opinion, Charlie most likely died at Freddy's, which could connect to this Fall Fest poster, where for some reason the puppet is used as a scarecrow and seems lifeless while the band are performing. There are also crows surrounding the puppet. Crows and ravens are often used to signify death or bad omens, so maybe the death of Charlie is represented with this poster, her death happening at Freddy's during Fall Fest. Next thing to talk about is the recurring fire that appears in Fall Fest. In the corn maze level, there's a painting depicting the aftermath of a great fire. In Phaser Blast and the carousel levels, they both get set on fire. What's also interesting is that when we play the levels that take place after the attractions burn down, the sky turns red, possibly as a result of the fire. And in Curse of Dreadbear, the sky sometimes turns from green to red, possibly indicating that a fire just occurred at one of the attractions. These recurring fires reminded me that in the Tales epilogues, the Mimic is described as having a shiny head and a discolored body that looked like it came out of a fire. So what if a Mimic Model 2 was at a Fall Fest event and the attraction that was stationed in caught on fire? Then later down the line, Mimic's original head would be placed onto this burnt Mimic Model 2 body. Or maybe it's the opposite. The original Mimic burned at a Fall Fest fire and then in the future it got a new shiny head. Either way, a Mimic possibly was at a Fall Fest fire. Whether it caused the fire or was just a victim of it is unknown, but I do think the former is more likely. So the question we have now is, if the next FNaF game will be set in a Fall Fest carnival, what can we expect? There are two possibilities I can think of. If the game is a prequel, then we could see the origins of Fazbear Entertainment. Steel themselves said they would be interested in making a Fazbear Entertainment Origins game. So maybe this prequel game could expand more on Fazbear's history, and maybe the main enemy of this game will be a Mimic. The game could also expand the origins of the original Mimic, and even Charlie's death. Then maybe the game will end with seeing this Fall Fest fire. But if we have a Fall Fest game that takes place after Ruin, then I predict that after the Pizzaplex was left in ruin, Fazbear Entertainment started small again to make some money. I can see the game taking place in a modern Fall Fest, with all new characters. Maybe like the circus and balloon characters we got merch of a while ago. Maybe the main antagonist could be Cassie, who is now under Mimic's control. Or maybe the main antagonist could be the Mimic after he escaped. And these new characters do look like mascot suits, so maybe the Mimic will jump into all of these mascot suits and try to kill us. But we'll just have to wait and see. So now, let's make a rough timeline of events. Pre-1970s, Henry and William start Fredbear's singing show. In 1970, the first Fall Fest. In 1973, the Fazbear Band are created. In the late 70s, Fredbear's opens and becomes successful, and the spring suits are invented. From 1977 to 1979, Edwin turns the costumes into animatronics. Early 80s, Freddy turns yellow, and is just referred to as Fredbear. In 1983, Fredbear closes down, then Freddy opens. October 31st, 1983, in Fall Fest 83, Charlotte dies outside of Freddy's. And there you go. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, subscribe, all that jazz, and tell me your theories about Fall Fest down in the comments below. Anyways, see you on the flip side.